The past 30 years have been a very special 30 years in the history of mankind when unique phenomena were created. Unique phenomena that had not been seen before were created because the United States pursued globalization while taking the lead. Since this phenomenon is very unusual in human history, there is a very high possibility that it will end within the past 30 years and return to normal human life, rather than the possibility that it will continue in the future. If we go back a little and think about the situation in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s, the United States at that time could not control the world alone. At that time, politically and militarily, a very powerful competitor, the Soviet Union, challenged the United States. And in the meantime, Japan made a sudden economic leap, and in the 1980s, Japan emerged as a strong and troublesome competitor from the US's point of view. At first, Japan was used as a kind of advanced guard role to check the communist bloc by elevating Japan as a partner of the United States. But Japan had grown economically so quickly and enormously. As for numbers, the most Japanese companies occupied the ranks between first and 10th by market capitalization. At that time, innovative technology was also completely and overwhelmingly changed by Japan. In 1987, 80% of total DRAM semiconductor production was done by Japanese companies. So, from the perspective of the United States, there was no industrial field in Japan that could be viewed lightly. At that time, the United States competed with the Soviet Union in politics and military, and with Japan in economic and innovative technologies. If we look at the movies at that time, there were spy movies against the Soviet Union like 007 movies. Movies about Japan at that time had a lot of content that was permeated with a sense of weariness and fear about Japan's economic power. The movie Blade Runner, which depicts the future of the 21st century, was a great shock to Americans because they feared an American society that Japan overpowered and dominated. At that time, there were many other movies showing Japan's influence on the world and Japanese culture leading the world. In the 1993 movie Demolition Man, the future in 2032 featured wealthy people from various Western countries wearing Japanese clothes. We can see how much stress the United States was under in the competitive landscape at that time, with not only the Soviet Union but also Japan and other cultures in 1980s movies. However, all these stresses in America were completely resolved in 1991 because the Soviet Union collapsed. From then on, the Soviet Union was no longer a competitor to the United States. Political and military rivals had disappeared. In 1991, the real estate bubble in Japan collapsed. The Japanese stock market first started to collapse in 1989, but real estate was rather stable, so the Japanese economy did not go into a state of total collapse. In 1991, real estate prices in Japan fell by nearly 20% in major Tokyo areas. The value of $1 million apartment fell to about $200,000. As a result, the Japanese economy entered the path of complete collapse. So 1991 could be said to be the only year for the United States to reach the top. After that, in the 1990s, the United States was truly a superpower. And the United States alone became a tremendous country that controls all orders of the world economy and politics. After the fall of the Soviet Union and Japan in 1991, the United States became a much more powerful nation. If in ancient times there was peace by Rome or Pax Romanica, peace by the United States or Pax Americana emerged after the 1990s. The logic of the United States, which has been so dominant, prevailed. That is the Washington Consensus and the logic of the globalization. The most powerful among them is the neoliberal logic of globalization. As globalization spread around the world through the United States, values themselves changed. Before that, there was a confrontation between the US and Soviet camps. capital and labor had a nationality. There was a time in the late 1980s when things like made in the USA and made in Japan were considered important. As globalization began, nationality was ignored and the logic of globalization took over the world as long production was the most efficient and made a lot of money. The biggest reason for this was that the United States, which leads the world order, took the lead and said that we should no longer consider borders in terms of goods and services. So the world has come to an era where the nationality of products has disappeared in the logic of globalization. The era of globalization has become a tremendous era in terms of efficiency. Because the world's cheapest labor and raw material, etc., were used to produce, production continued to increase dramatically. When production increases dramatically, there are cases in which wages rise due to full employment or raw material prices rise, which causes inflation to raise interest rates to soften the overheated economy. Therefore, the economy was subjected to periodic crises, and during this time, for 30 years, we were able to overcome the crisis fairly quickly. In the era of globalization, everything was controlled by the logic of capital and efficiency without border. For example, in China, when labor costs rose due to overheating the economy, entrepreneurs moved their factories to countries where labor costs were cheaper and accordingly, capital transferred to countries with less equipment investment. In the past, capital had a nationality, but in the era of globalization, the logic that capital has no nationality has led the way. For example, European money or American money did not matter, as businessmen brought money from countries with low interest rates and built factories in the countries with the lowest wages. In the past, it was impossible to invest in countries that were hostile or communist, but in the era of globalization, businessmen who had enough money from the United States and other Western countries entered China, where wages were cheap, built factories, and made profits. Money could continue to flow into China and other communist countries, such as Vietnam. Another issue is raw materials. In the past, there were many cases where it was difficult to buy raw materials from hostile countries. Before globalization, if raw materials were developed in an authoritarian and dictatorial hostile country, they could suddenly block and confiscate them. However, in the age of globalization, such behavior has disappeared. Countries that resisted this logic of globalization or challenged this US policy, namely Venezuela and Iran, have been representative countries. Countries that rebelled against the United States were subjected to strong economic sanctions by the United States. After the US sanctions, Venezuela's economy became terribly poor and devastated.